Hello and welcome back to my workshop. Today on the bench we have this beautiful French lantern clock. It has this gorgeous cast brass dial with porcelain inserts for the numerals, as well as this cast head dressing with the Gallic rooster, which is a symbol of France. The bell for this clock was made by Robert Dubois of Alpoy. He was a French bell maker active in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And if we take a look at the pivot holes for this clock, they are worn. Another thing to notice is the pivots do not extend past the plates. That is a pretty big issue that we will need to address. If we start this chime train, we can hear that beautiful bell go. I just love to hear that bell. Not very many clocks nowadays have bells. Turning to the side, we can see another major issue for this clock, which is that it's missing the crutch. It looks like it has just broken off entirely. Seems like there's some solder there, so somebody tried to put it back. We do not have the original one, so we'll have to make one based on intuition and some pictures I was able to find. Beginning with disassembly, we'll start by removing the hands, just like with any other clock. We'll also remove these chains, and it's interesting that these have chains. A lot of the time these lantern clocks had rope instead of chain. People would often convert these from rope to chain. Chain is easier to work with, it doesn't wear as quickly. I think that this clock had chain originally, and we can see that from the sprockets. They have little grooves cut out so that the chain will sit flat on the sprocket. I'll show you that later. With the chain removed, we can take off this bell. It has this really cool, massive, square brass nut on it. And the face can come off. It's held in by two pins, one on the top, another on the bottom. Now that the face is off, we can take off some of the wheels. This intermediate wheel is held on with one of those S pins. I don't like these, trying to untwist them and remove them. Now we can remove the motion works and the hour wheel. Next we'll remove these levers. They're just held in with a pin, and they can be worked out of the movement. And the springs for the hammer. And then the hammer itself. Now we'll take off the suspension. It's held on by just one screw here, and it will lift away. Looking at this crutch, there is some grooves, not too bad, but we'll polish them out anyway. We can take off the bell mount and the count wheel. Now we are ready to remove the wheels themselves. They're held in with these pins that hold the plates in place. They'll just fall right out once we've taken those out. Quick inspection of the main wheel with the ratchet seems to be working well. Now we can move on to the time side. Ones are a bit more tricky to pull out since the plate extends past. Kind of hard to grip them with pliers. Maybe we'll try a hammer and a screwdriver, see if we can push it out from the other side. No dice. Here's what I should have tried before, just using some needle nose so I can get a better grip on them. And there it comes. Now we can lean the plate forward just like the last one and pull the wheels out. This is the escape wheel. Looks pretty good. This wheel also looks good. The pivots don't look too bad, but they will need polishing. Getting these two wheels out is kind of tricky since they have super long pivots. And there they come. We'll check this ratchet wheel as well. Sometimes the teeth can wear out or the click itself. This one looks fine though, works great. Looks like somebody has worked on this clock in the past. There are a few bushings here on the escape wheel and the third wheel. They look pretty good though. With the clock fully disassembled, we'll clean all the parts in the ultrasonic. We'll rotate them. Any parts that are sticking out will get cleaned. Here it all is, laid out, nice and clean after the ultrasonic. It did a fairly good job at cleaning them up, but we'll give them a final polishing later. Taking a closer look at these pivots, they don't have much scoring and no coning as well, thankfully. That's what can happen if a pivot does not extend all the way through the plate. It can wear the pivot into a cone shape instead of a nice cylinder. Either way, we'll take these to the lathe and give them a good polish. Here's how we do that. We load the wheel into the lathe and we will start with a coarse buffing stick and move on to finer and finer until we have a mere finish. And here are the pivots, freshly polished. You can't really see a difference on camera since they weren't that bad to begin with, but they are much better. With the pivots polished, we can now check for wear, but regardless of wear, I will be rebushing all of the pivot holes in this clock, mostly because of the fact that the pivots do not extend past the plate. And what can happen then is the pivots, instead of wearing a egg-shaped hole, can actually start to burrow into the clock plate and cause all sorts of issues there. So what I'm going to do to fix that problem of the pivots is use a shorter bushing than the thickness of the plate. So the pivots will extend past the bushing but not past the plate. Here's a bushing that I've made on the lathe. This is a special one because the wheel needs to sit closer towards the front plate. So this is kind of like a cup in which it holds the pivot in place as it rotates. Now with the unworn side marked out, we can file away at that unworn side to get our true center back, because if I were to drill this as it were, the center would not be correct. And for these two bushings, I will not be using a reamer to drill it out. In fact, I'm going to be using a cutting broach just to enlarge the hole. Those two pivot holes are really close together, so instead of risking breaking the wall, breaching the wall, I'm just going to use a very, very small bushing. And as we broach, we need to make sure that we are going straight through the plate in order to not have a crooked bushing. We're ready to install the bushing now, and we'll just give it a few taps with the hammer. And we'll make sure that it is flush with the inside of the plate, and it is. And you can see the bushing is not flush with the outside since they're shorter. Now we will do more broaching to make sure that this fits properly with the pivot. Same thing with broaching out the hole for the bushing. We need to make sure that we're going in straight so that our pivot hole is not crooked. And we'll test it often. Now that we've broached it out to size and it fits, we need to test, make sure that it spins freely. Pretty good spin on there. Not quite what I would want. It doesn't spin for as long as I'd want. But you can see that it does, the pivot does extend past the hole. That's important, and it does turn freely. So now we're ready to finish this bushing. And what we do for that, we get a smoothing broach. And a smoothing broach is different than a cutting broach. Instead of cutting, it smooths, of course. We'll put a bit of oil on it and give it a few turns inside of the pivot hole. Now what this does is this work hardens the brass, so makes the surface last a bit longer, and it also deburrs the brass, removing any bits of brass that may be in there and just generally smoothing the hole out. And because these broaches are tapered, it's important that you go through the other side as well to make sure that the entirety of the hole is done. This bushing is finished. Now we need to do the rest of them. And after a lot of broaching, here's the end result on the chime side. It does not spin as long because it has the governor. And the time side. Pretty good. Now it's time to address the crutch situation. And we need to pull this old crutch off. In order to do that, we'll support the hub that the old crutch was sitting on. We'll use a punch to put over the pivot onto the shoulder of the arbor and give it a good tap. There it comes. Here is the arbor that that hub was sitting on. And the old crutch itself. As you can see, somebody tried to solder it in the past, so it's probably been broken for quite a while. And to make the new crutch, I will be using this sheet brass. This is 1.5 millimeters thick. And the original crutch was made out of steel, but brass is just so much easier to work with and easier to get. Here is the general layout scribed out. I'm going to be using this Dremel to get the majority of the shape cut out. In hindsight, I should have been wearing a mask. Brass makes very, very fine particles when sanded or ground, and it's very easy to breathe those in. I had a sore throat and a runny nose for quite a while after this. And we'll finish it off with file. And we'll put that 90-degree bend in it very carefully. And here's our new crutch. It's not the worst, definitely isn't the best either. But we need to mount this to something, so we'll go back to the lathe and make that something. We will not be using the original hub that the crutch came on. Instead, we'll be making a new one. I was able to take measurements from the original to make this new one, so it'll be as close as we can get it. Doing lathe work is some of my favorite parts of clock making. I really enjoyed making this piece. It's a fairly complicated piece. It has a center hole and 3 different diameters machined into it. Still easy enough to make. If you are looking to get into clockmaking, I would highly recommend getting a lathe. You don't need a Sureline lathe like the one that I have, but you can do a lot of work with a lathe. And yes, it is expensive, but it is also very fun. Now that we have our part, we are ready to mount it to the crutch, or mount the crutch to it. And to do that, before we do that, we need to broach out the center hole. As it is, it will not fit at all, even with the hammer, onto the arbor. So we need to make it fit. Not too much though, it still needs to be friction fit. And to mount the crutch to it, all we need to do is put it in. And hammer it. And what we're doing is we're peening the edges of the brass over the crutch. So as we hammer, we kind of drag the hammer away. And here it is, all done. And to mount it, we'll do a similar thing as how we got the original one off. We'll put a stake with the arbor going through it so that the stake is only interacting with the new hub, and we'll give it a few taps with the hammer and make sure that it's as deep as it needs to be. And as you can see, here it is with the escapement all put in, and it is running. Now that the escapement is complete, we can polish these. As you can see, these are the anchor, the pallets. They're not too bad, but they are a little bit worn out and not as smear finish as we want. So we'll do the same thing that we do with the pivots. We'll use these buffing sticks, starting with coarse and working our way finer and finer until we have our finest and we're left with a mirror finish. Speaking of mirror finishes, we will polish up all of the steel parts, or the iron parts. As you remember, they were pretty rusted, so we'll start with some pretty coarse grit buffing wheels and work our way finer and finer. In hindsight, I should have done this before I mounted the crutch, but oh well, it won't affect anything. It'll just mean that there's a bit of rust beneath our crutch, which is fine. And we'll do the same thing for all steel parts in this clock. What I've got here is one of this flat springs for the hammer. One thing that's neat about working on something this old is just how thick everything is. Pretty much everything is hand cut. There's no stamped metal parts or anything like that, so the steel is much more thick and hardy than what you see in modern factory-made clocks. To polish the brass parts, I'll be using this gel gloss. It is formulated for acrylic surfaces, but it works incredibly well on brass. We'll just be brushing this rooster's teeth with it to make sure that we get all the fine details in that cast brass. And after a good application, buff it to a shine. And this is what we're left with. Not terrible, much better for sure. Not quite what I wanted to get out of it, but you know, I won't force anything. We'll do the same thing for the dial. And because this stuff is formulated for acrylic or porcelain or enamel, we can use it on those numerals, and it will work quite well for those. And buffing it. And here's what we're left with. Again, not exactly what I wanted. I would like it to be a bit more shiny, but we won't force anything with this clock. And we'll do the same thing for all of the plates and wheels. Though for the wheels, we will not be using the toothbrush. I found that on a polished surface, using a toothbrush will usually leave you with scratches. So instead, I just use the buffing. And here's a before and after of the two main wheels, so you can see the difference that that stuff makes. It really does make quite a difference. And because we have gotten that stuff in all the pivot holes, we need to go through and peg. This will also be our final cleaning before assembly. Here are the parts all laid out again after final cleaning. They're much shinier, much more nice to look at. And we're ready to assemble. We'll start with the chime side, and for now we won't worry about timing. And if you've ever reassembled a clock, you know when I say that timing the movement can be quite a pain. But as you can see, the wheels themselves go in quite easily. It took me a while to remember where these levers go. And there's a hair here that you can't see, but I can definitely see it. That's better. Now that it's all together, we can work on timing it. And like I said, this one was quite painful to time. I think just timing it alone took me close to 30 minutes, 40 minutes. Quite a chore. But here it is, timed nicely. We'll test it. There's warning, and it's off. We'll test it one more time. Warning, and there it goes. Now that the wheels are all where they should be, we can reinstall these pins that keep the plates from falling out. And at first I tried to arrange them so that they would all fit properly, but then finally gave up and just realized, you know, the pins in the plate, it'll be fine. And as I went to put the pin back into the count wheel, I noticed that it was off by 90 degrees. The hole was on the other side. Fortunately, the timing is still correct, so we did not have to disassemble that. So it works just fine still. But just in case, I made sure that warning still worked and everything still worked properly. And we can go ahead and reinstall the escapement with our new crutch. And the motion works. But before we do that, I realized we've got to oil this. And we'll put a few drops on the post here. And also in all the pivot holes. And we'll put that S-shaped pin back in and make sure that it gets bent proper. Make sure everything's all nice and tight. And we'll get the face back on. It's kind of tricky to line up with that bottom pin. Eventually I just put it in my lap, installed the pin from there. There we are. And we can put the bell mount back on with the bell. And we need to adjust this so that the hammer is striking proper. We can now oil everything. In hindsight, it would have been much easier to oil when none of the levers were here and as we were installing. But instead, we just have to reach in and oil it as best we can. It's also important to oil the escapements. That's what I'm doing here. A little bit of oil every couple of teeth. And we are finally ready to put the hands back on. So after engaging the chime, we can hear it's striking 3 o'clock, so that's where the hands need to go. We'll put these tension washers back on with the pin. And you may have noticed that I did not do anything to the hands themselves. I think that these hands look fine. There's no reason for me to go destroy the original finish that they have on there and all that couple hundred years worth of rust build up, and I think that looks great, so we'll just leave it as it is. Tightening the last screws a bit, we're all done. Let's have a look at the before and afters. The dial looks fantastic. This is what I think the best. You can see all the rust is gone. Back is looking good as well. And lastly, the side. Everything looks great. So, ready to install it, but we run into some problems. So the new crutch that I cut here is supposed to sit down here. There's a little groove in the case cut for it to swing, but as you can see, it's a little bit too short, and in fact, the clock was running fast too. So I cut the crutch in half, cut a few notches and cut a few keys, and soldered it all together. My soldering job is not the best. However, it's functional, and that's what we need. I certainly wouldn't pass jewelry class with this. But as I said before, the clock was running fast, and the crutch has nothing to do with that. Instead, the suspension was too short, and I based my crutch off of the suspension wire that was in there before. So clearly it was not running properly when it was running. These French lantern clocks originally had a silk thread as a suspension. However, I won't be replacing that. Instead, I'll be using some wire instead of thread. I think that it'll last much longer. It's not original, but it is a better repair in my mind. And in order to sort of honor that original design, I'm taking some wire and twisting it. That's what I'm doing here to make our new suspension out of. Kind of give it a thread look. And we'll take this and cut it to the right size. And instead of having to take this clock back to its case, I've decided to build this stand so I can test it just in my workshop. And if we look around the back, you can see that new suspension lines perfectly with the new crutch. And after running for a few days, it was keeping excellent time. Here is the maker mark scratched in the movement. I cannot for the life of me make it out. There is also this code scratched in, 11847. It could be a date code for 1847. And here is the clock installed back into the case. The case is absolutely beautiful, lots of intricate carvings into it, definitely French. And if we come up to the top, we can see a curious thing. The clock has windows looking into the movement. Clearly somebody wanted this movement to be on display. Not very common for clocks back then. And that will conclude our video today. I hope that you have enjoyed watching. This clock had quite a few things wrong with it, had to make a few parts, but in the end, it turned out beautiful. Thanks for watching.